Tensions between the United States and Iran took another turn on Tuesday as Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and US President Donald Trump engaged in more heated remarks. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The Iranian President Rouhani has reacted strongly to US President Trump and the new sanctions he announced against Iran earlier this week. Rouhani called the sanctions, quote, outrageous and idiotic, and said the White House is suffering from a mental disability. Rouhani also accused the United States of being insincere in saying that it wants to negotiate with Tehran.
If you really wanted to negotiate, we would have negotiated. At the same time you call for negotiations, you seek to sanction the foreign minister. It's obvious that you're lying.
Well, President Trump lashed back on Twitter, saying Iran does not understand reality. Trump warned that, quote, any attack by Iran on anything American will be met with great and overwhelming force. In some areas, overwhelming would mean obliteration. So, tough talk from both sides. Joining me now to discuss all of this from Boston, Kaveh Afrasiabi. He's a political scientist who has taught at Tehran University. With me here in the studio is John Sitilides. He is a geopolitical strategist and consultant to the US State Department. Also joining me on set is Nega Mortazavi. She's a journalist and consultant editor with the British newspaper. And we hope to be joined by Robert Rabil from Florida later. Kaveh Afrasiabi, let me start with you. Alarming words there from President Trump in that tweet. Strong reaction as well from the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani on Tuesday. Now, you co-wrote a piece in which you say that the sanctions regime set against the Iranian economy is so brutal that it's likely to force Iran to take an action that will require a US military response. That's pretty serious stuff. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is part of an article titled "A Nuclear War in the Persian Gulf," in which me and my co-author, Professor Intezar, argued that the U.S. is apt to use tactical nuclear arsenal against Iran in a war scenario because of the Iranian deterrence capability as well as the lack of sufficient ground forces for the U.S. to acquire a quick and decisive victory in a war situation with Iran, which hopefully will not happen. But it's very clear that Iran is forced to consider pushback against these unjust and unlawful sanctions tantamount to an economic warfare following the illegal U.S. exit from the Iran nuclear deal that was blessed by the United Nations, obligating all member states to comply with its terms, which includes normalization of trade with Iran. And President Trump unilaterally and willfully scrapped the deal and bullied other nations to also follow suit. And fortunately, the rest of the world has so far resisted that. And in the upcoming Osaka meeting of the G20, hopefully China and Russia and others, Europeans in particular, will rein in on Mr. Trump and his rogue behavior and will diffuse the crisis. But Iran is a victim of U.S. aggression that is now turning into this logic of exterminism with Trump's talk of obliteration of an entire nation. That really reminds me of Hitler's hate speech against England. If you go to his speech in 1939 and 1940, there are striking similarities between the two cases. And Trump is now boxing himself into this hate Iran discourse that is anti-diplomacy and is escalating every day. You see some new shenanigans by the U.S. and its allies with the false flag operations in Persian Gulf and so on, adding fuel to the fire. And with these provocative moves by the United States, war is a realistic possibility incubated by the economic warfare that is really a case of self-fulfilling prophecy, just as US's embargo against Japan in World War II was.
John, do you think war is inevitable?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, I believe that the leadership in both Washington and in Tehran have a very, very pronounced interest in avoiding a military conflict. But I do think that we're going to see very tense diplomatic episodes in the weeks and months to come, but even in the days to come leading up to the G20 summit. And I think that's an important reason why the Iranian government has undertaken these types of actions, blowing up tankers, blowing up pipelines, shooting down a U.S. drone in the weeks leading up to the G20 summit, so that in the expectation that perhaps Iran can lean on European leaders, Chinese leaders, Russian leaders to lean on President Trump to scale back his maximum pressure economic policy of sanctions against Iran.
John, despite the tough words we heard from President Trump, he talked on camera earlier today, that's on Tuesday. He seems to be leaving the door open to talks. This is what he had to say. Let's watch this.
It's too bad this is happening. They're living badly right now. Their country's not doing well economically at all. That can be changed very quickly, very easily. But they have to get rid of the hostility from the leadership. The leadership, I hope they stay. I hope they do a great job. But they should talk to us decently. We're all for them. We want it to be done properly.
It's a bit of a mixed message there from the president. He says the leadership in Iran, I hope they stay. I hope they do a great job. One minute he's talking of obliteration, and the next minute he's saying, well, I'm open to talks.
I think we saw some of this Trumpian strategy in dealing with North Korea over the last 2 years, where there was, first of all, praise for the potential of the society. And President Trump has praised the Iranian people and Iranian society as the inheritors of a grand Persian civilization that dates back millennia. So he's been very clear about that, and that his problem is with the Iranian government's behavior over the last 4 decades. That's what this is really about, not about the Iranian people. And just the way he's used his very tough talk against North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, but also reassuring him that this is not about his personal survival. I think it's the same thing here. This is not about ousting the government per se, but if they change their behavior and act like a normal nation in the Middle East and on the international front, there can be an opportunity to choose economic development for the Iranian people as opposed to violent regional and global activities on the part of the Tehran government.
Nagar, were you surprised at the tough words that the Iranian president used there, condemning the United States? He also accused the United States of lying.
No, it wasn't surprising. Let me just add that President Trump did call Iranians a terrorist nation, and he also put a travel ban on Iranians who were mostly affected. So even in the messaging, it's a little bit conflicting. But from the Iranian president, it wasn't surprising. I think the rhetoric has been, the tension and the rhetoric has been increasing in the past weeks as the military tension increases. And we've seen this hardline rhetoric basically coming from Tehran. We see what was seen as a moderate camp, the president or even the foreign minister Zarif now joining more in unison with the hardliners, and we see a more unified hardline hawkish voice coming from Tehran. And it's also part of it a reaction to the voice coming from Washington. Let's not forget, again, as the other guest said, President Trump left the nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions, and then we're at this stage of heightened tensions without any real alternative or real strategy for diplomacy. He says he wants diplomacy, and I believe that he wants a better deal, he wants a different scenario, and he doesn't want war, but the way he's trying to get there is not necessarily basically the way that you would. He's more moving towards a military conflict, and I think it's a very dangerous situation. Despite the fact that top leadership on both sides doesn't want a conflict, I still think that they're basically at the brink of starting one.
John, do you see a game plan here on the part of President Trump, some kind of strategy on where he's going, what he wants to do?
If there is one, it's not clear what it is yet. I think that the two countries' governments are so implacably opposed in terms of what an endgame looks like. And the Iranian government has been very clear. They expect concessions from the United States in order for there to be a return to the table, and they won't renege on the terms that were agreed to in 2015 in the JCPOA. So any agreement that is going to be stronger from a U.S. perspective is a non-starter for the Iranian government. So I don't see how this plays out. And it could just be that the Iranian government is waiting out until 2020 and hoping that a pro-JCPOA president is elected in the United States. I'm not sure that's the smartest way to pursue a strategy right now, because that means the Iranian people are going to suffer under these sanctions. I mean, 80% of the Iranian economy is under U.S. sanctions right now for at least another 1.5 to 2 years. So I don't think that's the best way to proceed, but I don't see the exit strategy right now on either side.
All right, let's welcome to the show now Robert Robeil. He joins us from Florida. He's a political scientist and expert on Iranian foreign affairs. Robert, welcome to the show. I mean, listening
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, sir. How volatile do you think the situation is right now between the United States and Iran, especially when we hear words like obliterate? I mean, these are words that should deeply concern us, shouldn't they?
Yes, indeed, and I agree with your guest, Nigar. As a matter of fact, she put it in a perfect perspective. You know, the two are talking in such a bombastic and rhetoric, and what's happening is that, you know, through that boss leadership, they don't want to have a war, but the fact on the ground belie what do they want. Mainly, you know, it is dangerous. The sanctions, again, that United States put on Iran recently, yesterday, again, they heightened the tension between the two. And from the perspective of Iran, doesn't want to give in. And the president, I believe, he built his whole policy, you know, on the mistaken belief that Iran will give in and will come to the negotiating table. And I don't think that is happening anytime soon. Now, having said that, there is an opening, and that opening could be, for example, mediated by Oman, could be mediated by Russia, could be mediated by China, and it could be mediated by some Arab leaders. I heard some statement by United Arab Emirates leaders. They said, we don't want war. Well, this is now the time. This is not the time they say, okay, listen, let's go and let's speak with the Iranians. United States spoke with the Iranian in Oman. You know, United States spoke with Russia and indirectly with the Iranians in Syria. So this is where they need to create a deconflicting mechanism so as to prevent a war and prevent a confrontation, given the context now, how the two, you know, United States and Iran are behaving in the Gulf and in the region.
John, your response, very quickly.
Yeah, at the risk of over-analogizing what took place with North Korea and now what's happening with Iran, remember that Kim Jong-un called President Trump a mental dotard or something along those lines, and Trump responded that the U.S. has fire and fury of the kinds that humankind has never seen to be able to obliterate North Korea. And then we have the two leaders meeting on two separate occasions, and the president talks about the two of them falling in love and exchanging letters, but there's a dialogue in place, and you have China as an intermediary there. As your panelist just said, there could be a similar role for a country such as Russia, which has great credibility with Tehran, although that may be under question now, because I believe that John Bolton has been speaking with his Israeli and Russian counterparts currently to see how to move Iran out of Syria with the help of the Assad regime there. So I don't know to what extent Russia will continue to play that kind of a credible sort of role with Iran, but there are ways to possibly bring in another power. Maybe it's the European Union along those lines. We'll see how that plays out.
All right, let me go back to Kaveh Afrasiabi. Kaveh, President Rouhani has accused the United States of being unreliable. This is what he said. Let's listen to this.
You proved to the world yourselves that you are unable and break any agreement, and that you do not stick to your signatures. How do you expect us to negotiate with you all over again?
So, Kaveh, what are the chances of these two sides being able to talk through these differences? Is there an off-ramp here? For instance, would Iran be prepared to renegotiate the nuclear deal?
Well, for a moment, when Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Iran, the first Japanese leader in 41 years, I thought there was an opportunity for some sort of diplomatic breakthrough, which was unfortunately immediately torpedoed as the U.S. and its allies engaged in a false flag operation to sabotage diplomacy and cast Japan out of it. And, you can put a rational face on Trump's bellicose and warmongering policy, But the fact of the matter is that U.S. has behaved like a rogue superpower, bullying not just Iran, but also other nations, dictating the terms of the trade on them, and trampling on international law, on UN security resolution, and so on and so forth. And it's really a mistake to view President Rouhani and Trump as mirror imaging each other in their discourse, because one is a victim, one is the aggressor. The United States has bullied itself on the Iranian nation and is now on the verge of another unnecessary war. And you need to locate the historical root causes of that in terms of the U.S. war economy and the decline of U.S. power, the U.S.'s desperate effort to maintain a U.S.-led world order and to assert control of the Strait of Hormuz as a choking point and leverage vis-a-vis rising China as a challenger to U.S. domination, and so on and so forth. So I really think that this needs to be historically framed, and we need to look at not just Trump and his irrational dispositions. And by the way, President Rouhani correctly pointed out to the Nazi dispositions of President Trump in his UN speech last year. And the world needs to be very aware of that and rein in on Trump and his warmongers.
Okay. Nigar, Robert Rabil raised an important point a moment ago, and that is the impact that these sanctions are having on the Iranians, especially these latest sanctions. I mean, do you see Iran throwing up its arms in surrender and saying, okay, we give up, we've had enough, let's talk?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the economy is in a very bad situation. Inflation has been up all the way to 50% at some point. Price of necessities have gone up. It's the working class, the middle class, who are paying the price for all of this pressure from both sides, from both governments. But let's not forget this, the same Iranian state survived 8 years of devastating war with Saddam Hussein. They powered through. It was very difficult. I grew up during that time. It was very difficult, but this is not even comparable to that time. Iran is not going to be in the same situation like Venezuela anytime soon. And a year and a half until President Trump, the next office is basically determined, is not a long time for Iranians to be able to resist, as they're saying. And if President Trump were to use any openings for diplomacy until this point, I guess just as the Iranians explained, he has closed that by putting these sanctions on the Iranian supreme leader. That's one of the red lines, even though the sanctions are more symbolic and won't have much financial impact on the supreme leader's empire. But this was one of the main things the Iranians pointed out, and if they were not determined enough to resist the remaining year and a half, I guess now they have enough reason to do.
Robert Rabil, if you look at this from a regional perspective and all that can go wrong in a very volatile part of the world, is the United States making a strategic mistake in going after Iran in this way, raising the temperature so high?
Well, in war and in situation like this, if anything can go wrong, will go wrong. Let's not forget that. And you have certain indicators that if a confrontation is going to happen, it's not gonna remain in the Gulf or with Iran. It's gonna expand. It's gonna expand to the Gulf. It's gonna play out in Iraq. It's gonna play out in Syria. And last, let's not forget, you have certain statement by the Iraqi mobilizational units called in Arabic al-Hashd al-Shabi, who are in Iraq, who are today as integral part of the Iraqi government, and they could take some action against the United States. And you have Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon, who recently in his speech, he mentions that any war against Iraq is gonna put the whole region on fire. So mainly, God forbid, if that war is going to take place, I don't think it's gonna be contained. But here there is something to be said. It's not gonna be a classical warfare as we have seen before. It's gonna be very asymmetrical warfare, and it's gonna affect many people. And this is why it's going to be different, it's going to be uncertain, it's going to be brutal, and every effort should be made so as to prevent this from happening.
John, what are your views?
Well, when President Obama personally endorsed the non-binding JCPOA in 2015, one of the objectives of the Obama administration was the idea that Iran would begin to ameliorate its regional and international behavior and become a much more responsible actor. And instead, we see that the Iranian government has spent several $billions to prop up the Assad regime in Syria, hundreds of millions of dollars for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And so if the Iranian government had dedicated its resources more wisely to help prop up its own economy, you wouldn't have perhaps the kind of deleterious economic conditions that the Iranian people are suffering today. So I think their activities are what has resulted in the administration deciding after the Europeans had a year to try to work with the Iranians to improve the agreement. They failed to do so, and that's when the president followed through on his campaign promise to withdraw from the JCPOA.
Okay, Kaveh, I'll get to you in a moment, but John, just one question there, and that is, there wasn't much time in between signing that deal and Donald Trump dismantling the deal. I mean, we didn't see any effort, or we didn't see an opportunity to see the dividend from that deal.
Well, candidate Trump stated very clearly for 2 years on the campaign trail that he thought it was a bad deal from the outset. Right. So even if Iran technically was adhering to the terms of the agreement, he still thought it was a bad deal because it was compartmentalizing the nuclear weapons program from all of the other activities involving ballistic missile technology, sponsoring terrorism, destabilizing the Middle East, and that any deal with Iran had to include those components of Iran's behavior as well.
Right. Kaveh, go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, your guest in Washington is completely ignorant about the nature of executive agreements and UN Security Council resolutions that are internationally and legally binding. He referred to the JCPOA as non-binding when even by US's own standards, executive agreements, and I refer him to the case of US versus Pink, Supreme Court decision that says executive agreements are as binding as a treaty. And President Trump unilaterally and arbitrarily discarded the internationally known and respected nuclear agreement and has pursued this warmongering policy ever since that is getting more and more dangerous, has brought us to the precipice of war. So we need to step back from that and think crisis management, and the international community can only do so by reining on Trump and his warmongering advisors, and as you said, providing and presenting an off-ramp solution whereby there would be a gradual de-escalation of conflict, and perhaps some have thrown the idea of freeze for free, so other nations can embark on normal trade with Iran, just as the JCPOA calls for. And this war hysteria that is generated in the US would be extinguished only as a result of international diplomacy that is presently absent, unfortunately.
Nigard, there have been reports today, actually Tuesday, that Iran may reduce its commitment to the JCPOA, to the nuclear deal. Do you see Iran backing away from that deal in any big way? And would that make, if you couple that with the latest sanctions, would it make a diplomatic solution far less likely?
I see them pushing the limits. It's something they've been announcing and sort of giving a deadline to the Europeans, because let's look at from the perspective of the Iranians. President Trump pulled out last year, and Iranians gave Europeans a year to basically make up for the economic loss of US's absence from the deal. The Europeans came out very strongly with political statements, but as far as the economic benefits that Iranians were expecting from Europe, that didn't happen. European companies still are afraid of doing business with Iran because of the pressure from US government and US sanctions. So I see Iranians trying to push that limit to give Europeans a more sense of urgency, which we see that they're getting, but to basically force them to make up for the economic benefits. And also, in a way, another thing that's being discussed in Iran is that to give them more bargaining power if they were to negotiate something with President Trump. So President Trump has these sanctions that he imposed that he would lift as something as a bargain, and then the Iranians would have these limits of the nuclear deal that they violated or pushed that they would then return to the deal. So we've talked about what happened in the past year until now, but what now? I think now is the time for de-escalation as soon as possible, like the other guest said. Mediators, Europeans, regional, even Asian mediators to step in and then try to keep Iran within the limits of the nuclear deal before it gets too late, before a conflict breaks, and also to try to convince President Trump to lift at least parts of the sanctions to give Iranians the incentive to play along, basically.
Yeah. Robert, Nagar mentions the Europeans. We shouldn't forget that there are European signatories to the JCPOA as well. Is there any role for them right now in diffusing this in that part of the world? And there has been talk in the past of the Europeans using a currency mechanism or a trade mechanism which would effectively bypass or circumvent the sanctions.
Yes, of course, they have a role to play, but I think myself it would be better if it is Europeans and Russian and Arabs, you know, and to go ahead and do something. The Europeans in the Middle East, as much as the Middle East need them, as much as the Middle East look at United States and Russia and China. Let's not forget that you have a lot of changes that took place in the Middle East. And Europe today does not have the influence it used to have, you know, before the war and after the wars. Now, can I chime in and say something mainly in the middle between Gavi and John, if you don't mind?
Go ahead.
There is some things that John said and some things that Gavi said about, you know, Iranians' policy. John has a point, and Gavi to a certain extent has a point. Iran's policy, indeed, Iran plays to a certain extent a spoiler role in the region. It supports a non-state actor in Lebanon. It supports a tyrannical regime in Syria. It supports the Houthi. So there is that. But also there is another side to it, is that, and this is the question that has not been asked yet in our discourse, which is extremely important. Why Iran do this? Why Iran do this? Because it doesn't want the Arabs or other to dictate regional politics. And what do you have? You have indeed a rivalry between Saudi Arabia and between Iran. That goes back, you know, up to the time when Khomeini came to power and when Saudi Arabia supported Iraq. Let's not forget also, there is something extremely important and symbolic. Khomeini, on his deathbed, he looked at Saudi Arabia as the main threat to Iran. So really, United States or whoever is going to de-escalate, they have to have a parallel diplomatic channel so as to see what the region needs.
All right, Robert, we're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you with us. But before we go, a quick reminder about the Heats podcast. You can listen to some of our great content through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. The podcast covers similar global stories that we do here on the show, and we explore some personal and candid interviews with our guests and correspondents. Just search CGTN and you'll find it. Thanks again for watching.